Good evening and welcome to Spring Semester's Black History Month presentation of Black Conquistadors. My name is Professor Javier Gonzalez-Meeks, Assistant Professor of History at Miramar College. I want to thank you all for attending. I will do a Q&A at the end, but if you do have some questions during, I think Professor Mariah Gonzalez-Meeks put in the chat to put in the chat or raise your hand and we'll get to you at the end of this presentation. So how did this start? How did this start for me looking at Black Conquistadores? It actually started last year. Last year when I was looking and did a presentation on the demystifying Mexica Aztec culture as they were labeled as savages, barbarians, and heathens. And as I was doing my research, as last year was the 500th anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan, and I started coming across a couple of interesting characters, interesting historical figures, like Juan Garrido, and I was like, wow, this is interesting. And I kind of started diving into these Black Conquistadores. So that's where it started with, for me, was who were these Black Conquistadores? And then it went back to my own research when I was in graduate school, when I studied medieval Iberia, this very fascinating period called the Reconquista. And the Reconquista is going to have a major part in the conquest of not just Mexico, but the Spanish pacification, conquest, and colonization of the Americas. And we'll get to the Reconquista right now, but the Reconquista is a very fascinating period within Iberian history. After the Western political collapse of the Roman Empire, we saw a lot of Germanic tribes make their way across the Western Europe. One Germanic group, the Visigoths, set up their home right here in Iberia, and it lasted from about 400 to 700 CE until we see the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate right around the 700 CE. And there was one group that went across the Straits of Gibraltar right down here in North Africa and went into Iberia and conquered a large majority of the Iberian Peninsula, conquered the Visigoths. And from 711 all the way to 1492, a very important date, and we're all familiar with, right? Columbus set sail in the ocean blue and had really bad GPS and got lost. So it's a very important year. We'll get back to 1492 in a little bit, but for almost like close to 800 years, there has been a large Islamic influence, and not just Islamic, but African influence in the Iberian Peninsula. And for a lot of scholars, this period is considered the convivencia also. Convivencia in that the three major monotheistic faiths are all interconnected here in Iberia. You have a large Jewish community, a Jewish diaspora, the Sephardic Jews. Here in Iberia, you have a large Muslim population as well as a Christian population. So these three major religious faiths interacting. It's kind of like Thanksgiving dinner. It could be a little rough, it could be a little verbal, but no, they are very interconnected with trade and alliances. And as you can see on this image right here, the reconquest of Spain, that's the Reconquista. Who's reconquering what? You have these small Christian kingdoms that start to develop on the periphery of the Umayyad Caliphate in Iberia, the Caliphate of Cordova, and then they start to, quote unquote, reconquer Spain, right? They want to make Spain great again, basically. That kind of rhetoric that we're so familiar with in the last couple of years. So you have these militant identity that starts to develop, a very strong crusading mentality. And that's something to remember. This is a crusading moment. I mean, in our own Western sensibilities, we think of crusades, it's Christians versus Muslims, but it's usually in the Palestinian region. It's the sack and fall and rise and sack and fall of Jerusalem. But there are other crusades happening across Europe. There were Christian crusades against Christian kingdoms. The Pope sent a crusade against the Christian kingdom of Aragon because Aragon sacked a papal state. There was a French kingdom that would send a crusade against heretical Christians, so to speak, in France. There were also in Northern Europe, there was a Christian crusade against Orthodox Christians because they dressed and looked and spoke different. Mm-hmm. And so you have this very fascinating period. So this crusading mentality is very entwined in our own rhetoric. That we hear that a lot, right? And, oh, our crusade against the evils of whatever empire, pick one. And so this Reconquista moment is going to fuel the imaginations and the identities of a lot of Iberian young men. If you think about it, this is all they knew for over close to 800 years was this waxing and waning of fighting against Muslims and Jews and Christians. Now, it wasn't always Christians versus Muslims and Muslims versus Jews. No, it was not like that. It was actually a very, it was very interesting geopolitically. And one is a great example is this one crusader, Rodrigo Diaz, or El Cid. El Cid was banished from Castile, and he tried to make amends. And so he went out and he started to, fight against other Christian kingdoms that he wasn't aligned with to bring wealth back to his king that kicked him out. And he also fought against the Muslim states in Iberia to also show his devotion to Christianity. And it wasn't just fighting against Christians and Muslims. He had Muslims with him because some different Muslim states and kingdoms within Iberia were also fighting against other Muslim states in there. There was a lot of internal fighting. The geopolitics of this period was very fascinating. I mean, George Martin can write another Game of Thrones focusing on Iberia instead of the family affairs of what was going on in England. It was very interesting during this period, this waxing and waning of politics. But through 800 years, we see this very strong Christian identity that establishes. And it's individuals like El Cid that become the Spider-Man, the Superman, the Batman of the age, because they don't have that back then. Who are their heroes? Think about it. Who's your hero growing up? Mine was He-Man. I'm dating myself. But that was my hero. I wanted to be He-Man. I wanted to be Superman. I would jump up and down on my sofa, right? I wanted to fly. And El Cid was that hero for a lot of young men who wanted to pursue this crusading spirit of gold, glory, and God. And that mentality you can see also in the conquest and the pacification of indigenous peoples in the Americas. This, searching for gold, searching for glory for not just yourself, but for the king, and doing it in the name of the Christian God. So you can see that implanted in every single conquistador, from Cortés to Oñate to De Soto. All of them have these same characteristics, because these 800 years of this very militant Christian identity that was just ingrained in these young men. And it's also during this period of the Reconquista that you have a lot of different Islamic or Muslim states that rise and fall. It wasn't all unified, just like Christian Europe wasn't all unified. And this one group, the Almoravids, they started to conquer in the west coast of Africa and then started conquering the Iberian Peninsula. Their ideals were a lot more strict than other Muslims. So it they had a lot of conflict internally with other Iberian Muslims. And what the Spanish recognized and saw was that the Almoravids used Black auxiliaries, Black soldiers in their military. So for close to, see this period from the 11th to the 12th century, you have this interaction and this viewing of Black Africans as being fighters, as being noble soldiers. So that's going to be ingrained also. So you have this strong Christian militant identity that's developing. And then as you're viewing, you're watching, you see these very strong, very able African soldiers, Black African soldiers that are coming, fighting, and with good stamina against their opponents. So it's going to be this view. This view Iberians will have as of Black Africans as being natural warriors. And we're going to continue on. We're going to see how this idea will wax and wane as well, but we'll get to that point. But for right now, during this Reconquista period, the view of Black Africans as being natural warriors. And that's going to be important because as the Spanish start to pacify and conquer into the Americas, they need help. They will make some alliances. That's how Cortés was successful, was with alliances, but you're going to need fighters. And so they're going to look to what they know. And what they know was like, hey, those Almoravids use Black Africans. Let's bring them and help them, have them help us against the indigenous population in the Americas to pacify and conquer. So just exactly who were these Black conquistadores? A lot of their story is very interesting. And what this presentation is going to look at is a very select few Black conquistadores because they stand out. They stand out within the history books because what we're going to see is they have the jobs they do, what they accomplish, and the legacy, the evolution of race is going to greatly transform from the period of when they're heroes to the next generation when they're not viewed that way. So there was this story of the Black conquistadores also challenges our view of Black Africans coming to the Americas as only slaves. I mean, that's our mindset we're taught in US history books. And so anytime we talk about Black Africans, it's always the Middle Passage. It's always enslavement, 1619, pirate ship, bringing Black captives to Jamestown to sell as slaves. So even though we're not going to talk about that horrendous period of our human history, what we're going to look at is, the Black conquistadores, but the Black conquistadores challenges our narrative, that single story of how Black Africans came here. Yes, there were Black slaves that came with the Spanish. There were Black slaves that came with the Spanish. There were Black servants that came as well. A lot of these servants were unarmed, basically. That's how they're labeled, unarmed Black servants. And then you had armed auxiliaries, individuals like we'll see, like Juan Garrido. And so we get our first documentation of these conquistadores, these Black conquistadores, in around 1502. And we're look at Juan Garrido. And who was Juan Garrido? Juan Garrido was born in West Africa in the late 15th century. He would move, he's not a slave, he would move to Lisbon in Portugal. And then from Portugal, he'll move to Seville in Spain. And then he will travel. So he's a free Black man who travels to West Africa. He travels from West Africa to Portugal, then to Spain, and then he traveled to Hispaniola, to the Caribbean islands. No, why did he go there? We don't know. We don't know a lot about his past except for kind of bits and pieces where he bounced around to. We do know is that he joined Ponce de Leon in the pacification of the indigenous people in Puerto Rico and in Florida. And that's another thing we have to keep in mind too during this presentation. A lot of it, we're looking and talking and raising up the Black conquistadores, but at what extent? And that's going to be, sadly, on the indigenous population. That's going to be, for another discussion, right? Indigenous responses to colonialism and indigenous resistance to colonialism that will happen later. But right now, Juan Garrido is a very interesting figure. He travels to Ponce de Leon. He helps pacify and conquer indigenous people in Puerto Rico and in Florida. And it's in Florida where Ponce de Leon dies, but it's where Juan Garrido also meets another conquistador, and that is Hernan Cortés. And Hernan Cortés will then eventually travel across and go to Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, and Juan Garrido will be right there along with Hernan Cortés on the way to conquer Tenochtitlan with Cortés and his indigenous allies like the Tlaxcalans. So here we have Juan Garrido, a Black African who joins, fights, pacifies indigenous people in Puerto Rico and in Florida, and also in Tenochtitlan. At the end, he's awarded land. He's given land right by the city gates. He then builds a small chapel for a lot of the dead, the fallen conquistadors, martyrs. And that's his point of view. For the Mexica, they're not martyrs. The fallen conquistadors are not martyrs, they're invaders. But this is Juan Garrido and his point of view, his fallen compatriots, right? If he didn't hold flavor for them, he might not have built this Church of the Martyrs. But it shows that reverence he had for these other Spanish conquistadors, whether they were Black or Spanish. So he builds this church, to bury them. And eventually, after he passes away, close to 100 years later, a new church is built right on top, and that's San Hipólito of the Martyrs. So it still carries that tradition of the martyrs, still carries that tradition of the Spanish conquistadors that died fighting against the Mexica. And so what we have here is, Juan Garrido, being awarded land. He shows his devotion to God, right? He has land. He's doing it. He's showing his devotion by building this church, and he's also given huge responsibilities. He has a lot of jobs he is given by Hernan Cortés. He's like a city manager. He's in charge of the weights and measures, and that just keeps rotating around. One of the more important ones I think is important was that he was in charge of the Chapultepec Aqueduct. The Chapultepec Aqueduct, now it might not seem amazing, but it's one of the only aqueducts to bring fresh water into this city. That's important. Water is life. And so here you have Juan Garrido entrusted with a lot of positions in Mexico City, also given a title of protecting guardian of the Chapultepec Aqueduct. I mean, that's how much reverence Hernan Cortés gives Juan Garrido, gives him this different jobs. And so here we have Juan Garrido rising up within, will be colonial Spanish society. We will see one of the big legacies of Juan Garrido is that he's the first indigenous person, or non-indigenous, so first, I want to say African or European or non-indigenous person to successfully grow wheat in the Americas. And just think about what you use wheat for, right? And even the diet within, let's say, Mexican cuisine, flour tortillas, but also what else is wheat is used for bread, the communion wafer within Catholicism. So wheat, very important part of daily life, literally, the bread giving life. And you can also ferment it to make hard liquor as well. So Juan Garrido is very successful. His lasting legacy is the bread and the flour tortillas that we have. However, he'll get married, he'll have kids, but he had that call for adventure. He had a call for adventure, and he would continue to travel with Cortés on other journeys. And one of the more famous ones is when they journeyed from the Valley of Mexico, and they go close to Baja California, and they see Baja California, but a lot of the indigenous people have died. It's a smallpox, and they're trying to look for this. They're looking for China. They're trying to figure out where China is. They're trying to find another Tenochtitlan as well. Cortés struck it gold with Tenochtitlan, and Cortés is looking for another one, and other conquistadors are going to be jealous and want to do the same too. So Cortés, builds up this story like, hey, I think I found this, this fantasy city that we used to read as little boys. And in this fantasy story, there was this Amazonian queen, a Black Amazonian queen named Khalifa, who commanded an army of women soldiers, and also had fantastical like griffins and other animals in her island. And so when Cortés and Garrido, when they go and see Baja California, they're like, oh, that reminds me of that story of Khalifa. So California itself, the name has roots with a Black African queen. It was a fictional story but named after a Black African queen, Khalifa. And so here you have Garrido making journeys, and through all his journeys, he spent all his money. He doesn't get compensated. I mean, he's looking for to help Cortez to find the Tenochtitlan. They're not going to find it. And so he writes a letter to the Spanish king. And here's an example right here. We actually have a letter written by Juan Garrido. That's how we know about Juan Garrido. He writes this letter, and as you can see in the highlighted part, talks about how he's a resident of the city of Mexico. He's making a probanza in perpetuity of the king. So he's asking for compensation, right? He's asking for his retirement money, basically. And he talks about why. He served his majesty in the conquest and pacification of New Spain. He was present at all the invasions and conquests and pacifications, with the Marquis de Valle. Marquis de Valle is the Hernán Cortés. And he talks about how he kept traveling with Marquis de Valle to the islands of the Pacific, that he also went and pacified Puerto Rico. He went to Cuba, all of this that he served for the king, right? And then he says, I did all of this and I wasn't compensated. So, ugh. And then he puts the big one right here. It's like, I also domesticated wheat here. I successfully grew wheat. Without me, your Spanish soldiers would die, literally. There would be no communion wafer. There would be no bread, no flour tortilla, nothing. So, he lays it out pretty good to the Spanish king to ask for this, for his petition, for his money, so he can retire. And here's the actual document right here, which is quite amazing. But, however, Juan Garrido would die poor, 67 years of age. He'll leave behind a wife and 3 children. And though he has a sad ending, he has a very fascinating life of a conquistador. When we look within the, following the footsteps of the El Cid, gold, glory, and God. And he did all of that. He did all of that. And we see that even though he has a sad ending at the end of his life, it's very common with a lot of the conquistadors in New Spain, where they're out looking for gold, glory, and God. And they go in like the blaze of glory and just will burn out very quick. So there's one interesting story with Juan Garrido. There's another one, the story of the ones, basically, Los Tres Ones. And this one is Juan Garcia. Juan Garcia is, his status is a lot different. He's from Spain. He's Afro-Spanish. He's from this region in Extremadura in Spain, from a city called Trujillo. And it's the same region that Francisco Pizarro is from. And if you're familiar with Francisco Pizarro is going to be fortunate to go and find the Inca in the middle of a civil war and take advantage of that and conquer the Inca. And on his way to there, Pizarro goes and recruits Juan Garcia to go with him. So in 1530, we have Juan Garcia, who's personally recruited by Francisco Pizarro to join in his expedition to go and explore, pacify South America. They're lucky when they find the Inca in the middle of a civil war. And then what we see is a couple years later, Garcia participates in the founding of the Spanish city of Cusco. And very much like Juan Garrido, Garcia is going to begin a lot of lucrative jobs, very important jobs, like the master of weights, right? Not like weightlifting weights, but the weights of gold and silver. So all the gold and silver that is being taken from the indigenous population goes to Juan Garcia, and he weighs it, measures it, and he docks it, records it, and sends it to go on the ships to go back to Spain to the king. And that's a very important job. And he does this for about 3 years. That's his job. He's an accountant. He's an accountant taking account of all the gold, the silver, and other commodities that are being extracted out of South America, extracted out of Cusco, and then ensuring, taking account of what was been taken and sending that off to Spain, to the Spanish crown. And very much like other conquistadores, we'll see that he will use a lot of his own wealth. He will make money as well. And he will buy indigenous women. A lot of this is through encomiendas. So he will get tribute, and he'll buy his own indigenous women for help or for other services. And eventually, within 6 years, he'll return back to Spain. He actually returns back to Spain. He actually has his story is not as sad, but he will return back to Spain. On his return back, when he gets back to Trujillo, he will start using Pizarro for the end surname. And a lot of it says out of patronage. It's not that Francisco Pizarro adopted him, but it's a way of reverence, where Juan Garcia shows his reverence to Francisco Pizarro for entrusting, for giving this trust to Juan Garcia of being the master of weights, right? Allowing Juan Garcia to have a very high position and status. And with this position of power and status, he'll also bring his own illegitimate daughters, you can see on the slide, and her servant mother. So he has his own wife and kids back in Spain as well. So he has a very complicated life. We don't know that much about Juan Garcia Pizarro when he returns back to Trujillo. What we do know is he has a very interesting life. He's a free Afro-Spaniard who goes to South America, pacifies, conquers, gold, glory, and God, and then returns back home and to live the rest of his life doing whatever in retirement, basically. We have one last individual, Juan Valiente. But Juan Valiente has a different story. Juan Valiente is a slave. He's an African slave who's brought over. And his story, we don't know exactly when he's born, but we do know in 1533 that he negotiated a contract with his master, Alonso Valiente. We only know that because we have the documentation of it. And in this contract, Juan Valiente states that he will, if he's allowed to leave his master, Alonso, to go out and pursue his own wealth, that he will return the money plus interest back to Alonso. So for Alonso, he's like, it's not a bad deal. He's losing someone that can help him out, but Juan Valiente is probably not someone that's fit or that can be broken, mentally as a servant to, work in the fields. But if Juan Valiente, has this, warrior spirit, right? As the Spaniards recall from the Almoravids who used Black auxiliary soldiers and for conquest, Alonso probably sees like, hey, here's a good chance that I might get my money back as well as on interest, and he can use that money on whatever he wants, probably buy another Black slave. So it works out for Alonso. So he negotiates a contract, allows Juan Valiente to go out on these different expeditions. One of the first ones is when he travels to Guatemala. A lot of the people that go into a lot of these expeditions die. He survives. Then he joins another expedition that travels to Peru in 1534. Mm-hmm. And it's in this one where he is a little bit, does well. He does well when they get into South America. And he's one of many other people of African ancestry. And so that's what's interesting. We don't get a lot of who these are, except for the ones that stand out, right? But we do know there are a lot of Black soldiers that are going with the Spanish. Because why? And a lot of it's because the Spanish are outnumbered. They need all hands on deck. They need the fighters to help them pacify, explore, colonize the Americas. And so they literally need all hands on deck. They need individuals like Juan Valiente to go out and to pacify and conquer for the Spanish crown. And so what we see in 1534 is Juan Valiente making his way further into South America. He'll join another expedition that goes into what's present-day Chile. And there he'll help found the capital of Chile, Santiago. And so here you have within almost 12, 13 years time, when he leaves his master, he travels through Central America, through South America. He's promoted as captain within the army. So here you have someone, he's still a slave. His social status is still slave, but he has high status within his military rank. He's a captain, right? So he's a slave, but he holds this title of captain. And what we'll see is after the finding of Santiago, that kind of very similar to Juan Garrido, he'll be given land and property near the city gates. Very similar. And it's a way to kind of protect the city, right? You want to have your best guard at the city gate. Juan Garrido right there at the city gate to protect the city from any intruders, right? And here you have Juan Valiente in that same kind of mental state. You're going to have someone there to help protect you and protect the city. We'll see also that Juan Valiente will marry a former slave of the governor of Chile, and he'll be granted an encomienda, and that's indigenous labor, tribute labor. So here you have someone of social status that is technically a slave, but is a military captain, has married the slave of a former governor, and is given an encomienda, indigenous laborers, to work for him. So he's doing well. He's doing financially well, and he does send his money to Alonso. And however, that money never arrives. We don't know what happened. It's the 16th century, right? There's no Venmo, right? There's no Venmo. So it's like, hey, I'm going to entrust you with all this gold. I trust you to leave from Santiago, Chile, travel all the way up to Puebla in Mexico, and not get robbed or not take off with it. I trust you. So it's like, what happened? We don't know. We do know that Alonso Valiente never received the money. Alonso will actually write back to Juan like, hey, I never received the money. Send me the money. I want the money. He does. But Juan never sends it back. He said, I did send it. I don't know what happened to it. He's not going to send it again because the value of human forced labor is very expensive. Now, yes, Juan Valiente is doing well financially, but it'll be like, buying a second house. That much money, especially here in California, like to buy a house in California, it's very expensive. And to lose that money and then have your boss say, oh, well, go buy another one. That amount of money. And it's like, I can't, that's a lot. And so what we'll see is Juan Valiente was die in battle. It's a conquistador. His social status as a slave. However, he was a free man in Santiago. He wasn't treated as a slave in Santiago, Chile. He was one of the founding members for the city of Santiago. He had his own forced labor with the encomienda. He had high status in Santiago. So there's no way he's going to actually go back up to Mexico, to Puebla, and be like, hey, you know what? Everything good, Alonso, because then his social status is going to go right back down again. So very interesting period that we have here in colonial Spanish America, especially looking at social class and the development of social class, because this evolution of race will continue. When you look at Juan Valiente, he passed away, in the 1550s. Within almost 15 years later, we'll see a slave revolt with Yanga in Mexico, right over here. That creates a free, independent free slave society. The Spanish could never quell them, could stop them. We'll see ideas of even the 1600s, 1619 in Jamestown, where you have Black slaves coming to Jamestown in Virginia, right? So the evolution of race, as more and more of Black conquistadors and more Spanish start to conquer, pacify the Americas, they start to settle down, and then more Spanish are coming over, and then the ideas of where you belong start to evolve. The sistema de castas start to evolve also, where you fit into society. You know, how much Blackness do you have? How much, you know, indigenous blood do you have? How much European pure blood do you have? That's all what the sistema de castas are, right? How much Indio, how much African, how much Spanish blood do you have? And that can be absolved as well, which sounds ridiculous, but within that sistema de casta, it's a way to identify and control your large population of African and indigenous and mixed race population, especially as more and more white Spaniards start to make their way across into into Mexico, into colonial Spanish areas. Now, the ideas of the Black conquistador is not needed anymore, right? This time period after Juan Valiente, by the time you get to the 1570s, close to 1600s, no, there's not going to be another Juan Garrido. There's not going to be another Juan Valiente, because now the institution of slavery will take hold. Now, within Spanish society, they do allow for manumission, but there is that stigma of Blackness that's going to take hold of what opportunities you have in colonial Spanish society. And so what we'll start to see are these counter conquistadors, these Black conquistadors now that were fighting with the Spanish, now they're refusing to pacify the indigenous population as they see what the Spanish are doing to the indigenous people. Like, why are you treating these people like this? And why are you treating these other Africans like this? How do I know you're not treating me like this? And so what we have is a counter conquistador kind of movement. And you'll have also these Black pirates, right? There's these three famous Diego the pirate, right? They're going out harassing the Spanish ships. You have Yanga in the mountains in Mexico, you know, fighting for his own sovereignty and the sovereignty of other Black slaves. So what we have is this interesting evolution, and how those Black conquistadors fit in is a very interesting time and place, because wherever Black men played an important role in the conquest and pacification of the Americas. That was their role. That was what their function was. That is the legacy of that Reconquista, period. And wherever Spaniards set foot in the Americas as members of conquest companies, they were accompanied by Black conquistadors because of that legacy. And what we'll see is Black conquistadors, by definition, fought alongside Spaniards against indigenous warriors. It was by risking their own life, suffering in the fields, protecting Spaniards, and killing natives that Black men were able to improve their circumstances and enslaved, like Juan Valiente, fight for their freedom. This is a quote from Matthew Restall. He wrote this great article. A lot of what this presentation is based on Black Conquistadores. I have the PDF link, and I'll put that in the chat for anyone that wants to read it. There's a lot more information if you want to do more research about Black Conquistadores. It's all right there as well. But this is the story of the Black Conquistadors, right? Their function and what they functioned for that short period of time for the conquest of the Americas was very short, but a lasting legacy. And you see this, a very different picture of how Black Africans came to the Americas. All right, and so I'm